My name is John Hall, and I am the president of the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. So I am especially pleased to introduce tonight's speaker and his topic. As many of you know, the archaeology of the Southwest is often focused on certain areas that have spectacular archaeological remains, are near modern population centers, or have had sustained research for many decades or even a century. So these areas include the ancestral Puebloan region of the Four Corners or the Rio Grande Valley. Also the Hohokam area of central Arizona. Yet the Southwest also includes northwestern Mexico and is much more than just these few selected areas. Regrettably, some regions have even been assumed to have been archaeological backwaters of little interest or outliers or peripheral. The focus of tonight's presentation is one of these regions, the Jornada Mogollon of southern New Mexico, the Trans-Pecos region of West Texas and northern Mexico. Despite a general, pronounced, and undeserved lack of interest in the Jornada, our speaker tonight, Myles Miller, will discuss this region's fascinating and important archaeology. So Myles received his MA degree from Texas Tech University, and he has devoted nearly 4 decades of professional research in the Jornada region, resulting in many publications. He is a principal investigator with Versar, and notably, his significant and important research was recently recognized by the Society for American Archaeology in 2018 with the prestigious Award for Excellence in Cultural Resource Management. So without further ado, I am very pleased to present our speaker tonight, Mr. Myles Miller.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really very pleased that the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society has invited me to speak on the Jornada region. That was a apt description of some of the issues. We sometimes affectionately jokingly refer to the Jornada region as the Albania of the Southwest, where things don't come in and things don't go out. That's really undeserved. There's a lot of fascinating information, and it really truly is part of the Southwest. It is a Southwest cultural region. And to lead in to define where the Jornada is, it is part of southern New Mexico, Trans-Pecos or far Trans-Pecos, West Texas, and a little bit into northern Chihuahua. It's basin and range topography of the Chihuahuan Desert. You have the Roswell Oasis, where John Speth has been working for many years out by Roswell and the Pecos River. The Rio Grande River is the only other through river, and its mountains and basins, including Sierra Blanca Peak here that we'll be talking quite a bit about, and the interior basins. It also has 2 very large military reservations, White Sands Missile Range and Fort Bliss Military Reservation, that together are larger than the state of Rhode Island. So that kind of puts some of the archaeological work into context. The area also matches what Polly Shaftsma defined for the Jornada style of rock art, southern New Mexico, West Texas, and Chihuahua. And also one of the signature motifs of that rock art style is the so-called goggle eye or Tlaloc motif that Margaret Berrier has done much work on. This is a distributional map of the goggle eye effigies in rock art and other things. And it matches to the general distribution of what we call the Jornada region. And we're going to be talking quite a bit about these GE effigies, GE entities too. Now, for a little historical background on one of the reasons why the Jornada is kind of underappreciated or not really recognized among the larger Southwest, there's several reasons. There was kind of a limited university interest. That's been corrected recently with Bill Walker's work at New Mexico State University with Cottonwood Spring Pueblo. New Mexico State University was set up back in the 80s, was doing some interesting work in the Jornada. But generally, there hasn't been a strong university interest or academic interest in the region. Most of the work is cultural resource management on military bases or in response to urban developments in El Paso, Las Cruces, and other cities. And another point is that it from the way we used to survey and do survey work, it led to sort of a misunderstanding of what the archaeology represented. Back in the 1980s, we did not have a good grasp of the geomorphology, or the way that landscapes change and how that related to archaeological distributions. And so there were all these giant surveys on the military reservations, and Stead Upham was looking at these, and in these two articles, the American Antiquity article, he was making very valid points in discussing how much of Southwestern archaeology is really focused on the obtrusive, the really big pueblos and pithouse villages with beautiful polychrome ceramics, but there were vast areas that were under research that didn't have such visible or obtrusive remains, and that was what he called the underclass of Southwest prehistory. But what he did, he based that data on some survey data, and here's his quote: although more obtrusive Pueblo architecture exists in the Jornada region, especially between AD 1200 and 1450, the overwhelming majority of sites in the Jornada are LAS. LAS being limited activity sites, are non-architectural artifact scatters of just some ceramics and chipped stone flakes scattered around. Now, at the time, that was the primary academic article in the flagship journal, American Antiquity, on the Jornada. So Linda Cordell, in her classic treatment of the Southwest, in her unfortunately only one paragraph on Jornada, referenced Upham's work and said Upham synthesized data that indicate that less than 5% of the recorded Jornada sites are classified as habitation sites. Rather, the sites are typically sherd and lithic scatters, which indicates a highly mobile population. And that was 37 years ago, but still that was somewhat reiterated in the third edition in 2012. Now, unfortunately, those are, a lot of people got their introduction to Southwest archaeology by reading Cordell's volume and some of these other articles, and that gave this impression that it was mainly just hunter-gatherer archaeology. But part of that reason is, one, because of the geomorphology, the change in landscapes. This is the current topography. It's called Coppice Dune lands, or aeolian, or sand wind-blown lands. Back in the 1880s, this was vast, lush grasslands with topsoil. But due to overgrazing and drought, it blew away the topsoil. That created these mesquite dunes that captured sands and built these coppice dunes. And then in between is all this archaeology that's exposed. So much of the buried archaeological record is exposed on the surface for us to easily see and record, unlike many other areas. Like in East Texas, you have to do shovel tests to be able to find the buried sites. You don't even see them on the surface. So the other part is on these large military bases, they did huge surveys, cultural resource management surveys, where they were inventorying and documenting the sites so they could protect and manage them to try to prevent as much damage as possible from active military training. And they did 15-meter transect spacing on these surveys. These are 1 kilometer blocks of part of the Waco Bolson. And you can see with all that blown out landscape and exposed surface archaeology, there are dozens of these little sites. Each kilometer has 10, 15, 20, or sometimes 30 of what we called these small sites. And then there were denser areas here. This is probably a pithouse village here. But in the big balance of things, one village and probably 100 of these small little sites. So that gave this impression that 95% of the sites were non-architectural. But what I pose here is that if we lined up 1,000 industrious students and field school attendees and some CRM people, everybody lined them up, and with big leaf blowers or something, and we blew away 1 or 2 feet of topsoil across the Mimbres, across Chihuahua, across much of the Southwest, we would see these same kind of landscapes, 10,000 years of mobility and use and artifact discarded and lost distributed all over the landscape. And you would have those same types of 95% small limited activity sites versus the couple big villages and camps. And lately it's kind of gone full circle because we're doing even more intensive surveys where every 10 by 10 meter cell or 15 by 15 meter cell anchored by GIS and GPS handheld units is recorded. And then we put all that information, we record it in the field, put it in GPS and GIS programs, and we define these landscapes. And instead now of having dozens of small sites, we find so much material distributed over these broad prehistoric landscapes that they've become these large, massive aggregate sites. So now instead of having 95 sites, we only have one site. But again, when you look at the densities, you still have village areas. These are probably pithouse village areas in that large landscape distribution of 10,000 years of use across the landscape. So also, a lot of these limited activity sites, non-architectural sites that were recorded in the past are actually residential settlements. This is a good example. This was a limited activity scatter. It was about 5,000 square meters of ceramics and chipped stone, maybe a stain or two, nothing really obtrusive, nothing that visible. It was thought to be just a camp. But when we clear off the broad area, here you can see there's one axial adobe wall. Here's the other axial adobe wall. Here is adobe wall and roof melt. This is a 6 to 10 room pueblo exposed in what was once thought to be just a limited activity scatter. And what we found almost every time we do these small ceramic artifact scatters, we encounter buried pueblos, buried pit houses. We estimate at least 100, maybe 200 of such settlements across the Jornada region. Now, we don't have the 300, 500,000 room pueblos up in the northern Rio Grande or in Chaco or Mesa Verde or some of these other areas, but still when you add up 100 or 200 or maybe even more of these small 10, 20, 30 room pueblos, it adds up, and there is a lot of pueblo and pit house settlement across the Jornada. And the other point to keep in mind is a lot of this is rather short term. So they are moving across the landscape and constantly having to reorient and reposition themselves in terms of the surrounding landscape. And that's something we'll explore. And here's another example of kind of that underclass of prehistory, thinking that Jornada really has very little. These graphs that were put together on compilations of large pueblos across the entire Southwest shows huge areas. There's Paquime, Casas Grandes. Here's Chupadero Mesa. This is the northern Rio Grande Pueblos. And the Jornada has Henderson's site that John Speth was working on, Hot Well Pueblo, El Paso Archaeological Society, and a couple others between 1350 and 1400. When you get to 1400 to 1450, it's a big, vast wasteland in the Jornada. And that's kind of surprising because it sets up an interesting kind of ironic situation, because a lot of the models of Casas Grandes and Mimbres and other areas are built on this kind of tacit assumption that they're all interacting and having social and economic exchange with the Jornada region. And the example, of course, is the Casas Grandes interaction sphere. Whether or not you accept interaction sphere, the world systems models and other things that these were based on, still up to today, there is this assumption in the Southwest that Paquime, a big part of their economic zone, encompassed the Jornada. And indeed, when you look at and subtract the Casas Grandes core area, the big supposedly interaction of social and economic regions with Paquime, about 60% of it is the Jornada, which is interesting because if nothing is in the Jornada during that time, who exactly are the Casas Grandians interacting and exchanging goods and doing all this social interaction with? It sets up an interesting conundrum. Because here's the actual truth. This is the plot of many of the pueblos we know about throughout the Jornada. Now, I want to note that the locations of these have been randomly shifted. The site locations in this and other slides have been changed to protect their locations because this will be a publicly archived presentation. But the basic idea is there are pueblos all through the Jornada region. Over 70 known pueblos, and again, here's Sacramento Pueblo discovered just within the past 5-6 years or so, and it's probably a 60 to 70 room plaza pueblo. We've discovered a couple other of those, plus dozens of those smaller pueblos. Now, we don't again have the large 300, 400, 500 room pueblos, but there's still a big spread of 50 to 100 room pueblos. It is a really substantial settlement system in the Jornada region. It's not a big empty zone. And we have some amazing long-term data. This goes to the point of looking at the time depth of what we're going to study or talk about in terms of ideologies and cosmologies. Looking at the radiocarbon record, we have a 7,000-year record of agave baking in the Jornada region. 7,000 years. And the interesting part of that is also we can look at one period, specifically the Middle Archaic, and these are massive annular rings of rock. These are feasting pits. The rock is only fractured a little bit from heat stress instead of massively fractured from multiple uses. These are big bulk agave baking areas showing many groups coming back even in the hunter-gatherer Middle Archaic period and having these groups doing big bulk agave baking and feasts. And the fascinating part of that is this continuity, cultural continuity for 3,500 years to just a couple weeks ago in July, the annual Mescalero Apache puberty ceremony. Part of that 4-day ceremony is they dig a big pit, bring in dozens of agave hearts and bake them for several days and then distribute the baked agave as part of their annual feast as part of that puberty ceremony. So you can see this cultural continuity in the Jornada from 3,500 years ago up until a couple of weeks ago. And another continuity is the El Paso Brownware ceramic tradition. It's one of the longest lived traditions in the Southwest, from El Paso Brown up to El Paso Polychrome. El Paso Polychrome has its reputation as a unaesthetic or unappealing, aesthetically unappealing ceramic. But if you look at these on the bottom row, I can really contest that. And there is a lot of iconographic information encoded in El Paso Polychrome vessels. But the interesting thing is you can find an El Paso brown sherd, this one dating from the site about 8,500, and a unpainted El Paso Polychrome sherd from AD 1450, and it's almost impossible to tell them apart. There's 1,000 years of technological manufacturing consistency and social practice in the production of El Paso brownware. So that gives us this long-term perspective where we can track ideologies, different practices, ritual practices, and so forth, way back in time without some of the disjunctions we see in other parts of the Southwest where societies were abandoned and so forth. Not really abandoned, but where certain things changed through time. There was in-migration and out-migration, because the Jornada really truly has a sophisticated cosmology and a very diverse, beautiful iconography that reflects that sophisticated cosmology. We also have one of the largest radiocarbon records in North America that allows us to compare when certain iconographic elements and baking pits and technologies and house structures and everything, when they appear and disappear through time. We can compare the appearance of this iconography here and cave shrines and do various statistical analyses on the dates and plot them right here on such a plot of all these different dates, and then compare to the trend of corn, which is interesting because here is cave ritual and this iconography appearing several hundred years before we see this big increase in maize agriculture during the Pueblo period. And that's an important consideration that kind of goes counter to some of the prevailing narratives of Southwest archaeology. So 3 themes: past and present engagements with the landscapes of southern New Mexico and Trans-Pecos, Texas, the time depth of the beliefs, ideologies, and cosmologies underlying those engagements and forms of placemaking, and reversing the lens. That I'll probably run out of time, but that's how we take the Jornada, and instead of looking at other regions adjacent to Jornada and interpreting them based on kind of the misinterpretation of Jornada, we're going to shift that and look at those regions through the lens from the perspective of the Jornada. And this is basically, a lot of this has to do with the beautiful approach of landscape archaeology in the Southwest, which Severin Fowles terms the Southwest School of Landscape Archaeology. All through the globe, people relate to their surrounding landscapes for spiritual connections, for political legitimacy, for all sorts of activities and actions that legitimize their existence and constitute their beliefs and their and so forth to these landscapes. And I've kind of lost my track there. And in the Southwest, we have that too, of course, and that's what we're going to look at. We also have this striking vistas. Southwest landscapes are really beautiful. Anybody who's traveled or lived in the Southwest recognizes that. And one of the most important aspects is, unlike almost everywhere else in the globe, what Severin Fowles brings up is that we have the descendant communities of the people who created these past prehistoric landscapes still living on those landscapes today that we can interact and consult with and learn with. Native Americans key into these landscapes in different ways than we with our Western eyes do. And so we learn valuable lessons on how to interpret these past material remains, these past landscapes, by consulting and speaking with Native American consultants. And this is a wonderful example, the rock art site in New Mexico. This is the view shed from the inside of the shelter taken by Mark Willis, because we're taking interior and exterior view sheds of all the rock art sites we work on. And there's some water in front of it. And then out in the background here, way off in the distance, is a somewhat little meseta hill. It doesn't really seem like much. You might not think that that is important, but one of our Native American consultants, a Hopi consultant, told us in our perspective from this context of this rock shelter and this view shed, that would be a significant landscape feature. So the field crew went out, Mark Willis, the consultant, and some other of our crew hiked out there, hiked to the top, and sure enough, it's a stacked ring rock shrine on top of that meseta. So these are the sort of things that we can learn and understand better by that gift we have of being able to interact with descendant communities. So we're going to look at mountains and caves and engagement of the Jornada Mogollon people with landscapes. And we're going to start with mountains and caves. Mountains and caves have a lot of interrelated beliefs and meanings and symbolisms, both in Mesoamerica, throughout ancient Mexico, and in the prehistoric Southwest. They're the origins of ancestors, ancestral emergence, rain, and spirits, and several other facets. Caves are portals to the underworld, and also places of tribal emergence, where you go back and reenact that emergence from those caves. And we're going to start with Sierra Blanca Peak. Most people in El Paso and New Mexico area who are actually watching this think of Sierra Blanca Peak as where you go ski during the winter. But this is one of the most profound peaks in southern New Mexico. It's the highest elevation in southern New Mexico and one of the highest peaks in the state. And in terms of prominence, prominence being the distance from the landmass to the peak, it's the most prominent peak in all of New Mexico. It's very sacred. It's one of the sacred peaks to the Mescalero Apache, and we can be pretty certain it was sacred in past times. And here's the GIS view shed of of Sierra Blanca Peak. And there's a couple shadow areas created by high mountains, but before this current of our modern world of where it's rather hazy. I can remember growing up in El Paso and having crystal clear views of the desert for hundreds of miles, and now it's rather hazy. It's very sad, but in the past, you could see Sierra Blanca Peak from almost the entire Jornada region, a exterior view shed, all the way to Roswell Oasis, down to the southern Hueco Bolson and the Mesilla Basin. So on a small swale across from Sierra Blanca Peak is this shrine. Stacked rock circles, standing stones, several cairns, and this is at an elevation of 10,300 feet right across from Sierra Blanca Peak. And I would posit that this is a analog of a world quarter shrine that you find in northern New Mexico. Now, not exactly a world quarter shrine, but those are directional shrines of the cosmogram of the directions, the cardinal directions from settlements and sacred mountains to the northern Rio Grande Pueblos. And I think this is an example in the Jornada because it's right next to one of the most sacred peaks. And we're trying to do some drone photography and document this better and get a better view of how some of the cairns and things are oriented. But I think this is a major shrine dedicated to that major mountain. And we're finding quite a few shrines in the Jornada. Another example on the Otero Mesa, again, circular stacked rocks, upright stones, and cairns are another item of these shrines that help differentiate them from maybe sheep herders' houses or domestic structure rings from the protohistoric or historic period or other things. These are pretty clearly shrines, and especially also because we're going to look at their view sheds. These have point of vision or point of view, line of sight views with sacred mountains. And the view shed from that shrine looks out over Diablo Plateau and Otero Mesa to Alamo Mountain and the Cornudas Peaks, way out on the distance there. And here's a beautiful picture by Mark Willis of these sacred peaks sitting way out alone, isolated from all the other mountains out on the Otero Mesa. And Alamo Mountain is one of the greatest concentrations of those goggle-eye effigies. Margaret Barrier has documented 104 of these goggle-eye effigies on Otero Mesa and on the various caves and rock facets around there. So it's a very sacred location. And this is of real interest. This is work all due to Mark Willis mostly. A couple of years ago during one of our rock art projects, Larry Lohendorf and Margaret Barrier, Mark Willis, and some of the team went out to look at the rock art at Alamo Mountain, and they discovered this little square rock shrine. And this seems to be a common kind of shrine with some of the rock art localities, these little box shrines. And since then, Mark Willis has gone out and found another one and another one on 3 of the directions. He's still looking for this one, but we have 3 but are probably directional shrines around this sacred peak of rock art. They're probably a processional pathway around that precinct. And again, there's another example of these little stacked or square shrines. This is a rock art panel, and there's a little rock shrine below it. They're somewhat common. And so this is real interesting because, again, it's not just the rock art, it's not just the mountain, it's not just the shrines, it's all of this landscape features, both constructed and natural, all put together and all then in light of sight from other shrines. And if you look at this box shrine, off in the distance across the Diablo Plateau is Cerro Alto Peak. Cerro Alto Peak is the highest peak in the Hueco Mountains of the southern Hueco Bolson. Now, Cerro Alto is important because that is the ancestral peak of the Islero del Sur tribe in the lower valley of El Paso, a post-Pueblo revolt tribe. They consider Cerro Alto as the place, the residence of the abuelo, which is kind of a translation of the Spanish abuelo, our grandparent, grandfather. And it is the tribal kind of beneficent tribal deity who resides on that mountain. It also gives kind of the moral foundation of tribal behavior and other aspects. So we have that connection between again, a descendant community and a mountain. And then on another site, there's Cerro Alto Peak. Again, here's a stack rock shrine with the view shed towards it. And here's another view from that site. There's Cornudas Peak, Alamo Mountain, and even further in the distance, White Painted Woman or Guadalupe Peak. Guadalupe Peak's the highest point in all of Texas. It's also one of the sacred peaks to the Mescalero Apache tribe called White Painted Woman, and there's a cairn. So again, these connections, intervisibility between peaks, shrines, and sacred landscapes. Now we're going to move from mountains to what goes inside mountains, which are caves. Caves are places of ancestral emergence, underworld spirits, water, and underworld, and so forth. And what we're calling these now, we've determined that these are shrine caves. They aren't just caves. They aren't just caves with occupation debris in them. In some of these, they're actual shrines where past Jornada, Pueblo, and pithouse dwellers traveled to in religious processions to reenact heritage and myth, not myths, I hate to say myths, but oral traditions of tribal emergence. Ceremonial Cave is east of El Paso in the Hueco Mountains. In 1926, it was discovered by some hunters and was being looted. Eileen Alves, a fascinating person in the early archaeology of El Paso area, helped start the El Paso Archaeological Society, she engaged the Ladies Auxiliary, all these wealthy, the upper crust wealthy ladies of El Paso in the 1920s, took some of their pooled funding and purchased the artifact collections from the looters. And those are now curated at Texas Archaeological Research Lab at Austin and Centennial Museum at UT El Paso, and are available for study through her actions. Other collections are available from Harriet and Bert Cosgrove, who most know from their work digging pueblos in the Members Valley, but they were sponsored by Peabody Institution and dug in 1927 and 28. And this is a shrine deposit at the interface of the dark zone and the entrance to the cave. And in that shrine were so many objects like prayer sticks, marine shell, tablitas, mother of pearl inlays. This is probably part of a Kachina mask or some kind of similar ancestral or Kachina mask, a bracelet with turquoise, and then 800 to 1,000 sandals, which is part of that pilgrimage or procession aspect going to these shrine caves, where for some reason we're still studying that. They leave these in these shrine caves, hundreds or thousands of sandals. Here's another cave with multiple galleries. All of these locations have rock art, but we're going to look at this one far to the left. It is panel 1 of, and this is really interesting because it has all of the signature attributes of the Jornada style of rock art defined by Polychevsky. It has terraces, animal claws, animals, goggle-eye effigy, and masks. All those elements are there. Now we have some ideas what some of these may mean, some we don't understand, but collectively this is probably an emergence narrative. And what's critical to note is how this terrace was something coming out of it. There's old photos from the El Paso Archaeological Society showing that that little sloughed off stone piece once showed that this connection, this something emanating or emerging from this terrace was connected to it. And note how this is strategically placed next to these niches in the cave. And a couple of years ago, Polychevsky wrote a wonderful article in American Antiquity talking about little niches in kivas. Kivas are the religious structures of ancestral Pueblo settlements all through the Southwest. And she proposed that those niches were actually metaphors or symbols to caves, to watery underworlds. In essence, they were the cave in the kiva. And what I would suggest is this site here is similar to the kiva in the cave. There's other examples of these terraces. Here's one from Surat Cave down in the dark zone where they're painted. Here are other examples. Here's way in the back of this cave is a polychrome example, this relationship between these terraces, which are called one of the nuclear symbols of Southwestern iconography and caves. Another example of a shrine cave, Cave Kiva at Waco Tanks, with these beautiful masks painted on one of the walls. And goggle-eye effigies, this is deep inside Feather Cave in New Mexico, and Arrow Shrine, and probably this effigy came from that shrine cave. This is another shrine cave, and this is interesting. It's very large. It has a lot of these ancestral masks, and what Larry Lohendorf and Mark Willis noticed while recording these masks is that the mouths are very similar to the mouth of the cave. So you have that interesting relationship between masks, emergence, and a natural emergence feature there. And there was last week's talk was about macaws in the Southwest. On one of the panels, rock art panels inside that shelter is this beautiful pictograph of a macaw. Now, what's also interesting about this shrine cave is in the very back is a water seep. And this relationship between water seeps and shrine caves is really important because water, the origin from the underworld, from a seep inside a cave. There was once a shrine around this, but it got kicked apart by looters and other people, sadly. But you have a connection between water seep and a shrine, and leading from the very back of the cave, as if emerging with the ancestral mask in profile, gazing out, you can kind of emerge out and see the view shed of 18,000 square kilometers of the Waco and Tularosa Basin. Now, one of the aspects of this is we can hypothesize a lot. These are shrine caves and mountain shrines, and we have Pueblo and pithouse settlements. Are they really connected? And that's one of the kind of conundrums. We have lots of intervisibility studies of mountains and shrines in the Southwest, but that material evidence specifically linking them is hard to find. Well, one of the more significant findings of the past decade or two of Jornada archaeology is we're doing those ultra intensive surveys of examining every 10 by 10 or 15 by 15 square meter cell. We take that data back and then we can query the GIS routines to say, show us the ceramic distributions. And when we do that, these linear patterns of ceramics across the landscape appear. And some of them have pot breaks. These yellow triangles are pot breaks right in line with those ceramic shirt scatters. These denote prehistoric pathways, pathways of communication, trade, exchange, interaction amongst the basins. We have over 200 kilometers of them either mapped or hypothesized across the basins. Now, one of the points is, if they went from different pueblos, playas, other areas, surely if these shrine caves were truly that important, we should find some connection between pueblos and those shrine caves on the landscape. Well, a year or two ago, we were remote sensing this area of known pueblos that El Paso Archaeological Society worked on back in the 60s. Unfortunately, some crazy people built an actual corn and wheat farm on this location back in the 1900s. It operated until 1918. It's going to make pollen studies from this area real interesting someday, when you had 20 years of corn and wheat growing on this landscape. But unfortunately, it kind of plowed and flattened everything. But doing remote sensing, we identified what we're pretty certain is the adobe outline of a very large Plaza Pueblo. This is Alamogordo Site 1, House 2, that was dug by Bradfield and Stubbs back in the 1920s, and the map is in Laymer's monograph on the Jornada region. And you see how that fits. There's 75 rooms. This is probably 70, 100, 125 room Plaza Pueblo here. So that shrine cave I showed a little bit ago is about 7 miles away. Is there a connection? Well, we looked at the GIS data. Unfortunately, this graphic kind of loses something because I took the aerial background, or actually my GIS person, Kit Jones, took the GIS, the aerial topography out of it to preserve and guarantee the safety of the site location. So we lose a little bit, but here is the fields that erase some of the distribution. Here's the survey parcel. There's the shrine cave. Here's that 100-room Plaza Pueblo, and there is a direct path of one of those ceramic pathways from the Pueblo to the base of the cliff below that shrine cave. And so here's one of the true archaeologically documented pathways, processional pathways, or pilgrimage routes, if you will, from a major pueblo to a shrine cave, where the people occupying that pueblo did journeys in reenactment of these tales of tribal emergence and petitioning for rain and ancestors and other things inside that emergence cave. So another part of this is, while they traveled to these places, they also brought materials back. I call this bringing the landscape home. And they brought materials back to, like, this artist's rendition of Firecracker Pueblo in Northeast El Paso. And we're going to return to Sierra Blanca Peak. Here's this crystal. On this little spot at about 10,500 feet is a real unique outcrop known to gemologists and rock hounds all over the Southwest as an outcrop of beautiful smoky quartz crystals. Smoky quartz is the most rare type of quartz crystals. And people were going there all the time and trespassing because some of this is also Mescalero tribal lands. So the Forest Service prohibits access to that now. But up there are these quartz crystals, smoky quartz, and then the shrine is over here a little ways. This is Madera Quemada Pueblo. This is the communal room archiva of the Pueblo. At Jornada Pueblos, the communal room archiva is built into the fabric of the Pueblo. Now, they terminated these Pueblos when they left them to move on. They did a ritual termination. What they did is They put objects on the floors of rooms or in the subfloor pits, and then they pulled down the wood and took the good wood, because wood is precious, and then burned a layer of adobe and wood on the floor, and then buried the pueblo in a small layer of trash and debris. And they ritually closed that occupation, and in essence, they severed the connection between that social group or that lineage and that location on the landscape. And you can see in examples of pueblos, the communal room is the inception point or initiation point for ritual termination. And then sometimes the surrounding rooms catch fire or are burned too. So this is part of the act of ritual termination. And at Madera Quemada Pueblo, they also, after they burned and collapsed the adobe, in the mound of adobe, they dug a pit. And in that pit, they deposited 153 items of minerals, pigments, crystals, shell, fossil, stone, and cave speleothem. Speleothem is a fancy word for flowstone, calcium, and other materials in caves, stalactites, stalagmites. And all these materials were deposited in there. Corn pollen does not preserve well in the grinding aeolian or sand sediments of southern New Mexico. It's recovered sometimes, but in this entire pueblo, the only corn pollen we recovered was from this pit. So along with all these materials, they also deposited sacred corn pollen in that pit. And here is that crystal from Sierra Blanca Peak. So somebody traveled from Madera Quemada Pueblo on probably a procession or pilgrimage to that shrine, then went over the peak, mined a piece of a place, a quartz crystal, and then that ended up in the termination pit here. And we will look at a couple types: this quartz crystal, other crystals, fossils, and cave speleothem are the items of interest here. All the items in that pit were gathered from a 12,000 square mile area of southern New Mexico, which is, I think, sort of a travelogue, a memorial, a memory, reciting the connections of this group to the surrounding landscape. And the other interesting part of that is, here is the pueblo. This is a communal room. That is a storage room. It was terminated and they left the pueblo before these two rooms were even occupied, but all of the habitation rooms have a paired item that was found in that ritual termination pit, showing that this was kind of a communal effort, a communal organized effort to terminate and sever this connection. So all of this has these communal connections, political connections, religious and spiritual connections to the surrounding landscape. And Richard Bradley has the elegant term for this: pieces of places. And this is a very human thing. People all over the world keep things and keepsakes. When you go to the beach and with your family vacation, you bring home a seashell and you retain that for many years. That's a piece of a place. And in religious terms, bringing back icons and items, or holy water, or things, all of these are in essence bringing back pieces of place from ritually, spiritually charged areas. And those pieces of places retain the spiritual essence and the connotations of those places on the landscape. And so we see these then deposited in ritually charged places in Jornada Pueblos, and even in baking pits. So this big fossil was put as a dedicatory item in the baking pit of a big agave pit. And fossils are very common. A lot of times they're coated in hematite. Sometimes they're used probably for healing rituals too. We find a lot of ground and engraved and incised fossils that are part of some connection of healing with the surrounding landscape. But like in this case, this is an emptied storage pit, and there is a fossil that was drilled, coated in hematite, and then left in that pit, and then they covered up the room, and that was a termination object left in the pit as part of the abandonment. Another part are speleothem. This is Yubar Cave. This is a shrine cave with a shrine inside the cave with rocks, arrows. It's an arrow shrine, which is a kind of a common, not very common, but it's kind of common. We wonder how many probably were looted in the past. There's probably many, many more of these, but ranchers and explorers and other people probably took all the goodies away. It has prayer sticks, arrows, and then standing upright in the middle was a big stalactite fragment. Again, that relationship. And here's one of the more interesting relationships. There are two forms of speleothem, aragonite and calcite. They just have slight chemical differences and crystal differences. This is a aragonite sipapu. It was obtained somewhere in a cave. Again, that connection with ancestral emergence. And it was carved and placed as a sipapu inside a kiva. A sipapu is the symbolic point of tribal emergence inside the religious structure of ancestral Pueblo groups. So we have this fantastic connection here between the symbolic emergence point inside a kiva and then the manufactured out of something on the landscape that also references that point of ancestral emergence out in the landscape. There's another piece of a stalactite that was found in this burned kiva. We find evidence that they are intentionally mining these things. We found, mining probably isn't the correct word, I should say quarrying. We found a couple places where they are chipping fossils out of the limestone. There are limestone fossil quarry sites. This is another spot. This is a absolutely almost inaccessible small rock shelter in a sheer perpendicular or vertical cliff face. And my intrepid crew went out and carried an aluminum ladder down the arroyo, up 1,000 foot of talus, and then climbed that up 35 feet to document and record what was in the shelter. There wasn't much in the way of habitation at all, but this is interesting. Mark Willis noticed and took this photograph. This is probably a worn step, or I'd say undoubtedly a worn place where somebody prehistorically climbed up several times into this cave. And it's kind of like in the Pajarito Plateau where we find trails and handholds and footpaths eroded into the soft pumice, although this is limestone. So there's a footpath, part of a footpath leading up. And here next to a seep, again, that connection between water, cave, and crystal is a quartz outcrop that was mined or quarried for crystals. You can see big areas have been battered off of that. And then we found one fragment on the floor. So they are actually going to pretty inaccessible places to mine these sacred materials. So this is part of the social and political engagements with the landscapes of the region. I like these two quotes from James Sneed, who's done so much wonderful work with ancestral Pueblo landscapes. The practice of placemaking is less a consensual activity and more a political strategy for establishing historical precedents with sacred overtones. And engagement with the past is central to the Pueblo worldview, so that origins and organization are two sides of the same card. And this is how, in some ways, both define spiritual connection. These groups relationally constituted themselves. They found social identity and spiritual connection and also political legitimacy in those connections between sacred landscapes, pilgrimages to those landscapes, and their places within their domestic habitations. And again, different forms of this terrace. This is a photograph by Scott Nicolai. It is a carved terrace in the limestone floor of Feather Cave. So you have that terrace not only painted or pecked as a rock art, but actually carved. Here's one in shell from Sacramento, Pueblo. This was found on a mountain cache by Doug Acom, a calcite terrace. These are from Pueblo kivas, or communal rooms, carved altars, one with paint, and there's a little spot there probably for incense or something. And so these communal rooms have these stone altar terraces, which relate to, again, mountains and caves. And one of the more outstanding examples of El Paso Polychrome, again, kind of counter that narrative that El Paso Polychrome does not have iconographic information and is a crude, unappealing ceramic. Look at these fantastic terraced vessels that are some of the earliest in the Southwest that reference mountains, the directional quadrants. They're cosmograms of the Pueblo world. And we find these as kiva bowls. And here's a nice example, one from the Jornada and the Huaytecanye medicine bowl from Zia Pueblo that Leslie White talks about in his 1962 ethnography. And they would go, the people from Zia Pueblo would travel to the mountains and bring back stones from those quadrant cosmogram sacred landscape mountains, bring them back, and then place them in the 4 quadrants around this mountain cave landscape cloud bowl. And that was clearly a reenactment of this cosmogram. And so this, in Leslie White observed this in the present century, and you can go back 6 centuries or so, 1300, 1400 or so, and see the same practices occurring in Jornada Pueblos. Now, time and tradition, a lot of these thoughts and the underlying cosmologies and beliefs have a much deeper time depth than we've thought of. These goggle-eye effigies, again, most people thought they came from Mesoamerica, 1300, maybe 1200. They were called Tlaloc figurines. That associates them with Aztec or Mexica, and that is a late post-classic manifestation. I don't think Tlaloc is an appropriate term for them. Maybe a Mesoamerican storm god analog or something else. And the reason is because we're going to show some dates, but Margaret Barrier, this article just came out a couple of days ago in Journal of Texas Archaeology and History, and she's been documenting these. This is a whole series of them in Waco tanks. And she, through using D-stretch, is finding there's a lot more variation and really refining some of the bodies and attributes of these. This is interesting because the goggle eye is in a niche in the cave. Again, that relation between niches and so forth. There's over 600 goggle eye images documented in rock art, mobiliary art, or portable art, and other things. Now, recently, we have dated these over the past few years. We dated these 2 effigies from Feather Cave and Yubar Cave. We didn't date the pigments, we dated the actual flattened agave stalk background of them. I dated 2 more, but I can't show the illustrations of them. But we have 4 effigies that have been dated, and many years, about 20 years ago, Marvin Rowe, in the development of the plasma oxidation dating method, actually dated these goggle eyes from Waco tanks, and the dates were very early, way too early, and a lot of people assumed, or they inferred, that it was old charcoal. From burning old wood led to using old charcoal in the pigments for these, and that's what made them so old. But actually, we've now confirmed the true age of this major iconographic entity of Jornada rock art. This is just a Bayesian phase analysis. That's a fancy word, fancy method kind of that analyzes radiocarbon dates to refine the date range. And it places the beginning period of these at around 600 to 700 AD, which is several centuries earlier than most people have thought are accepted. And I say this is when this ideology and iconography appeared. I don't say arrived, because arrived seems to have a connotation that it came from somewhere else. It may have been an indigenous belief system that became manifested through more intensive iconographic expression around 8600 or 700. And we also see it's not just these that are dating later. These are the panel of effigies and tablitas that form one group at around 600, 700, up to 80, 1000. There's a whole series of earlier dates that my colleagues, Daryl Creel and Phil Geib and I have dated from Ceremonial Cave and other caves. Prayer sticks, hafted projectile points or foreshafts, curved throwing sticks and other items. And here's the dates for those, which go back a couple thousand years, up to, as early as 1000 BC, and one way up here, if that date is correct, up to 3000 BC, 5,000 years old, which shows that the iconography changed, but that ritual in caves, these use of caves as shrines, had a really significant time depth in the southern Southwest. And there's other examples too. Our neighbors over in Big Bend, Mount Livermore in the Davis Mountains at 8,300 feet. Back in the 1800s, a shrine of over 1,700, there may have been 2,000 or 3,000 of these Livermore points in a cairn on top of the mountain peak. They recently found another one. So again, even in Big Bend area, here's connection between ritual use and ritual connections between elevated mountain landscapes. And in the Jornada, in the Archaic, this bench in a cave had 207 projectile points, mostly archaic, along with hematite, limonite, pallets, cruciform, shell, and a stone pipe. And this is interesting. This is a whole cave, has archaic abstract rock art. And from a crack in the ceiling, you can see the calcium carbonate coatings, which shows whenever it rains, this seeps water, and here's all these parallel lines of archaic rock art from that crack, showing even earlier connections in archaic with this concept of rain and seepage in rock shelters. And then also, we've been documenting rock art on limestone exposures. And the more we look, the more we find these. It kind of makes me shudder of all the surveys I did in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where I walked over vast panels of rock art on bedrock exposures, and I did not look or notice that there may have been petroglyphs engraved on them. So again, these engagements go longer in time. We've been dating through plasma oxidation, the zigzag motif, and it goes back 500 BC up to 1500 BC. Maybe this panel, that's the one from Ceremonial Cave, that might go back 5,000 years if that date is accurate. So these engagements with the landscape go back at least 5 millennia. Now, a couple other types of engagement. When we record rock art sites with Sacred Sites Research and Larry Lohendorf, we record everything, the archaeology surrounding it and the plants. And it's interesting working with Native American consultants because quite often they're as interested in the plants growing around the rock art as they are the rock art itself. This site is way out in a remote area of New Mexico, miles away from any water or anything. It wasn't discovered until just a couple of years ago by a BLM range and wildlife specialist who noticed there are some abstract engravings on the top of these boulders. And if you look miles away from water or anything, this is a profusion of wild desert tobacco growing around this. One of the Native American consultants gathered a bushel basket of native tobacco to take back with him. So there's this connection between rock art and tobacco and other entheogenic or hallucinogenic or psychotropic plants. Here's this photograph by Margaret Barrier of profusion of desert tobacco in a rock art panel. Here's tobacco growing in an inaccessible rock shelter, datura growing outside a rock shelter. This shows this is native tobacco growing actually inside a little niche in a rock art panel. And then Larry Lohendorf has published a paper. Some of the work we've done in southern New Mexico shows this connection between this diamond motif. And when you find this, quite often you will find wild tobacco growing next to or in the vicinity. In the vicinity, I mean right next to or outside of the rock shelter. So there's an interesting connection between these landscapes. Over 70% of the rock art sites we documented in the southeastern New Mexico had native tobacco. Only 25% had no plants. We've also identified datura, Texas mountain laurel, Lindenmeyer's morning glory, marigold. All of these are psychotropic or entheogenic plants that might have been used to attain altered states of conscious. And of course, there's Ceremonial Cave again, cane pipes, two of which Cosgrove discovered still contain plugs of tobacco, and of course, cloud stone blowers from Pueblos, showing a connection going out to these rock art and cave sites and leaving tobacco all the way back into archaic times. Now, real quick, I'm probably getting out of time. Reversing the lens, how does Jornada relate to adjacent regions? It really has a lot of important implications. I've been working a lot and enjoying a really productive interaction with my colleagues in the Mimbres region. Daryl Creel, Barb Roth, Pat Gilman, Roger Stokes, Scott Nicolai, Barb Roth. I know I'm Steve LeBlanc. I'm probably forgetting somebody, please forgive me. And working with our group with Margaret Barrier, and other people interested in the Jornada and rock art, oh, Harry Schaefer too, in the members, we're now pretty well established that there's a common cosmological foundation with similar iconographic expressions, but those expressions are distributed in different ways and different degrees among various media. As ceramics, because you know the, of course, great members black and white tradition, but there's also the great Jornada rock art tradition. And so there's different distributions. The Southern Plains, a lot of the Southern Plains and Plains Pueblo work took place mostly in Pueblo 5 times, it seems, after around the 1450 period or 1500s. Jamie Clark, John Speth have a volume on the Roswell Oasis, Henderson Pueblo and Bloom Mound, a wonderful document reporting on several field seasons of work out there that has some fascinating new perspectives on Southwestern Plains interaction during the 1300s and 1400s. It takes some of this back. And it's not quite a Jornada thing, but we've also been working on the merchant site way out in the very corner of southeastern Mexico on the plains, where this is not supposed to exist. We have a 50, 60, 70 room jacal pueblo with kivas and corrugated ceramics and probably gridded agricultural fields all out on the plains, and then around 100,000 bison bone in midden deposits. There's a much more dynamic mosaic of things happening between Southwest and the plains a lot earlier. And finally, Paquime and Casas Grandes, I'm going to reverse that lens, and let's look at Casas Grandes from the Jornada. I'm only going to show one example. There's this kind of presupposition that there were massive quantities of shell and massive quantities of ceramics coming into the Jornada region. Well, when you actually look at ceramic quantities, medieval period polychromes are vastly flooded over by Chupinero black and white and some other types. And if you really look at the distribution of El Paso Polychrome, in some places you can say there was a Jornada interaction sphere or a Chupinero interaction sphere if you use ceramic distributions as the criteria to define these kind of, whatever you want to call these interaction spheres. But also the quantities of marine shell using Tim Graves' database on architectural features. We went through and mined it and documented pretty much every incidence of marine shell collected over 100 years, 507 rooms, 173 burials, dozens of offerings and caches and shrines, and we come up with 16,594 items. Now that's not, of course, all of the shell in prehistoric Jornada, but that is a pretty substantial sample of rooms, burials, offerings, and that doesn't also take into account thousands or tens of thousands of square meters of excavation in middens and surveys and so forth. Now, back in the 70s, in a survey of Fort Bliss, in this little niche, the bald eagle catch, 2 El Paso vessels. This size over here illustrated about 30 centimeters in height. They were filled with 50,000 items, of which 36,579 were marine shell. And what is kind of a sobering thought that all of the material from 500 rooms and 173 burials could essentially fit in one El Paso Polychrome olla. And that kind of puts it in perspective that yes, there was interaction, but maybe the magnitude is not what we are assuming. And maybe we need to look at Casas Grandes and its interactions with other regions using a different set of assumptions and a different set of models. So to close this out, this is one of my favorite slides. It sort of sets up, this is somewhere in southern New Mexico, and it sort of sets up my feelings on things because it's kind of a metaphor for Southwest and Jornada. This road is the Jornada, and the Jornada is part of the Southwest, but there's a sign, this is not Southwest. Well, we can see now that is not true. The Jornada is a truly significant and interactive part of the greater Southwest. And I close with this beautiful image here by Wayne Suggs Photography. If you go onto his website and look at the fantastic photographs of rock art in landscape settings and other landscape pictures, it's really some beautiful photography. Here again, to close, is where we started with Sierra Blanca Peak in the starlit cosmos. Beautiful picture, and below it, at Three Rivers Rock Art Site, is this panel intentionally positioned towards Sierra Blanca with, again, those terraces, mountains, caves, emergence. You have footprints like Hopi or Zuni footprints coming out of it, emerging it. And I think what we've seen throughout this is that the members of Jornada Mogollon communities, they move through these sacred and animated landscapes that were interwoven with social memories. And the shrines, pieces of places, trails, kiva altars, and designs on ceramics all recited enduring narratives of emergence and becoming. So for the Q&A, I'm going to leave this up because all this work rests on the shoulders and the broken backs and sore arms and destroyed rotator cuffs of a lot of my colleagues and friends over the years. I really want them to get credit. A lot of time I just sit here and write up all the hard work that they do. Special notice and commendation of their Environmental Division of Fort Bliss, Bureau of Land Management, Carlsbad, New Mexico, and our Carlsbad Field Office, White Sands Missile Range. The bulk of the work is cultural resource management that was funded by these agencies and supported by them for going on almost 40 years. I also want to thank Tim Graves, who I call the Dirt Whisperer. Most of the excavations in this presentation were done by Tim's artistry in dealing with subtle variations in Pueblo and pithouse settlements. Mark Willis, who did the wonderful photography, photogrammetry, he's the guru of that. Margaret Barrier, who's documented rock art all through the region and willingly shares her wonderful photography and knowledge of rock art. And also my colleague and friend, Larry Lohendorf of Sacred Sites Research, who for over a decade now, we've documented, I think up to somewhere around 70 now, major rock art sites all through southern New Mexico and West Texas. And all these other institutions, fellow contractors and researchers, all these friends, I know I've forgotten somebody and I really apologize. And especially the hundreds of field personnel who sometimes don't get credit. They're the ones who worked hard and collected all this excavation and survey data. So leaving this up, I will turn it over to Charlotte now, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This has been an amazing lecture, and I learned a lot. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, and just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A button. You press the Q&A button and then type in your question, and we can get those answered for you. So we have one about the tablitas, and asking if you can go a little bit more in depth on what they are and how they're used.
Well, there's some debate. Some are clearly effigies rather than tablitas, and others seem to be the, if I could go back, the very first slide shows a wonderful pictograph at a cave that Robert Mark photographed. Tablitas are the ceremonial headdresses worn in current Pueblo society dances, in the plaza dances. And you can go online and look at the Rio Grande Pueblos and just Google dances. You will see people wearing terraces and other things on them that represent these ritual reenactments. So tablita is just a ritual headdress, and we find pieces and fragments of them. Most of them are damaged, or there's only small fragments, but we think those are probably masks and ritual headdresses that were used in these kind of dances.
And are the tablitas represented in rock imagery?
Excuse me?
Are those tablitas represented in rock imagery at all?
Yes, quite well. Actually, yes. There's, again, if people go to the announcement, they will see a really wonderful example of one in pictograph art where there's a mask image with a tablita headdress. There's several more that Margaret Barrier and others have documented where there's faces or even goggle-eye entities that have that tablita headdress around them with things coming out, feathers or other things. So it is, it's not really common, but there are tablita headdresses in prehistoric rock art. And then also that tablita a lot of times represents that terrace image, which is very common in rock art and also in carved and painted art.
Awesome, thank you. We also have a question about turquoise. The question is that there's a statement first that via, and I'll butcher this and I apologize, Ahumada in Chihuahua has some significant amounts of turquoise. And so then the question is how much turquoise has been found in the Jornada region?
There's quite a bit. We did one study years ago from Madera Queimada, and the assignments were kind of questionable. I know Alex Curota at Office of Contract Archaeology has worked with Allison Thibodeau on sourcing some. I would really like to resource some of the materials that we excavated. There's also a turquoise source in the Jornada proper at the Haria Mountains, right in the center of the basin, where actually that's where Tiffany, the great Tiffany Jewelry and Lamp Group got their start mining at the Ora Grande there. So we have local turquoise sources, and I think, I wish I'd have to refresh my mind on where the turquoise at Villa Ahumada, where they sourced it, is coming from, and where some of the turquoise in the Jornada is coming from. Some is from the Haria source, some is from more distant sources like Cerrillos and places in Arizona.
Great, thank you. We have one more question, and that surrounds the, if you could repeat the name of the contemporary tribe whom you mentioned have a connection with the grandfather as their tribal deity.
That is Isleta del Sur Pueblo of El Paso, or the lower valley of El Paso, also the Tiwa. It is, they're related to the northern tribes, but they are a post-Pueblo revolt tribe that came down during the Pueblo revolt and established several missions in the El Paso lower valley.
And I like,
And it's up there on the credits too, listed among the three tribes, kind of in the third tier of credits. They're listed there.
great.
And there's some ethnographic sources and ethnographic work on that.
So we've had a couple more questions come in, and one of them might be able to jive off of that. Can you recommend a lay source to learn more about the people of the Jornada region?
The contemporary tribes are there's.
That's how I read it, but it doesn't say. So Paula, if you want to put into the Q&A, you're welcome to.
Well, there's I'll address both. There's a lot of ethnographies. The Mescalero tribe has several popular publications. One is through White Sands Missile Range. That's a wonderful public presentation, our public brochure on sacred sites, plants, rock art, and how they look at sacred landscapes. There are some ethnographies. They're easily accessible, a lot of them in PDF form through Google searches. The Tiwa have their ethnographies. There's one they published several years ago, a multi-volume set of archaeology and ethnographies. And I think you can get that through a portal at the Isleta del Sur Pueblo website. And of course, the Hopi tribe, you can find material on them all over Arizona and elsewhere. And then prehistorically, there are a lot of individual reports. There hasn't been a good synthetic volume. There's the volume Texas Beyond History from Texas A&M Press. Nancy Kanmatsu and I wrote a chapter on the Jornada and Trans-Pecos back in 2004. It's a little bit dated, but it's a good layperson's introduction to the region. And then more recently, there's a edited book by Tom Rochek and Nancy Kenmatsu. Here are their names here, on the prehistory of the Jornada region, that has a number of contributors and chapters that offers a bunch of interesting views, including a chapter on those trails and a bunch of other real interesting research. So do a Google search on Rochek, Kenmatsu, and Jornada.
Thank you for answering both sides of that question. We have another question about the idea of evidence for the flower worlds. Do you see any connection between the Jornada Mogollon and the idea and evidence for flower worlds which have been identified in Paquimé and Mimbres? And please,
there is, but it's somewhat muted, and there are sometimes vegetal and plant imagery in the rock art. It's not very common in ceramic art. We do have a lot of representational motifs in El Paso Polychrome. People don't think that that happens, but in the whole vessel archive I documented, there was maybe 10 to 15% representational. But a lot of the plant imagery does not seem to be flower world oriented. It's more towards cacti and maybe datura. There's a interesting panel in southern New Mexico and southeastern New Mexico that may be datura pod. It also could be prickly pear pads. There's a little bit, but it's really not widespread in the Jornada, like it somewhat shows up in some Mimbres ceramic art.
great.
So there are a couple differences between Jornada and Mimbres and Jornada and Coppice. There seems to be some real commonalities, and those commonalities have some time depth, but there are also things that are missing. Like, of course, one of the major things missing between Jornada and Casas Grandes is there are no ball carts in Coppice. Despite 50 years of work and surveys, nobody's ever found a verifiable confirmed ball cart.
Sticking on the theme of floral motifs, we have a question asking if the abstract triangular design that you mentioned that is found in early rock art relates to the flowers of the plants that are found nearby, or could.
That's an interesting question. It may be more, I have to refresh my memory on that one. I wish I had the, Larry Lohendorf did an interesting comparison, because those triangle motifs, they actually show up in water gourds of Taro Mar, and they have a specific meaning. And so it may be one of these metaphorical or indirect, or again, these combinations of interrelated meanings between tobacco and water. But to directly answer the question, they really, to my mind, they don't resemble tobacco plants or datura or any other kind of plant. They are some form of abstract design.
Great. And we'll go with one last question. And thank you for staying up late for us, since you're not in Arizona time.
Yeah.
Can you date how long the Manso have been in the region?
Date how long the Manso have been. I would say they're still in the region. Their descendants are actually, back in the 80s, we worked with the Piro Mansa Tewa tribe of Las Cruces, trying to get them federal recognition. We had an attorney who specialized in tribal legal issues. We were trying to work the tribal roles, because part of one of the first parts of getting federal recognition is getting a tribal role. But there were various issues and problems that arose, and unfortunately they did not get recognition. It fell through, but they are part of the Manso heritage. There's probably a lot of intermixture and intermarriage in the lower valley of El Paso between the Piro, there were Manso and Tewa settlements in those various missions. Socorro mission was Piro. His letter mission was Tewa. And I may be confusing something there, but there was a lot of interaction, especially as the years went on. So Manso is a post-Pueblo manifestation that I would not hazard to date when they became an identifiable ethnic entity, but I would say they date to right now, even today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing everything in the lecture and in the questions and answers. I really appreciate it, and all of our participants do as well.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion. And thank you, and thank you all the listeners.
Absolutely. I hope you all have a good night.
Okay, good night, and thank you.